Hello and welcome to this special Kaiju Masterclass presentation. My name is Steve Ryfle and I'm here with co-host Kyle Byrd. And our special guest today is Dr. Matthew Alford. Dr. Alford teaches international politics at the University of Bath in the UK. And he's also an author and documentary filmmaker who's deeply interested in the subject of propaganda and Western power, particularly in how the United States Armed Forces have systematically used the Hollywood film and TV industry to shape public perception about the military and about war and about American intervention overseas. Dr. Alford is the co-author of the excellent book National Security, The Shocking New Evidence of Government Control in Hollywood. And he's one of the producers of the 2022 documentary Theaters of War, which is currently available on a number of streaming platforms. Welcome, Matt.
Yeah, good to be here.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you for joining us today. It's a really interesting topic. And just to get us started, we have many questions for you. Sort of a preamble into how this connects to the world of Kaiju and Godzilla, which, as you know, we're kind of interested in here at Kaiju Masterclass. The roots of Godzilla are kind of tied and sort of parallel this subject matter. Back in the 1930s and 40s, the Japanese government, the military government, took over essentially the Japanese film industry and used it to make war propaganda films to stir up enthusiasm for the war in China and also the war against the United States. And Eiji Tsuburaya, the effects man who essentially created Godzilla, he kind of cut his teeth on these war films, creating these fantastic representations of military battles in miniature. And later, during the occupation, the American-led occupation forces also essentially took over the Japanese film industry and censored all the content going through, particularly with respect to references to the war and the atomic bomb. So there's a pedigree here that's at work. And so pedigree is probably the wrong word, but there's a theme that goes all the way back to the origins of this character. And it continues on in the Hollywood films that are being made that feature Godzilla today. So just for starters, can you kind of give us an overview of how the U.S. Military and the Department of Defense became involved in Hollywood film production?
Yeah, so the Department of Defense has existed since the mid-1940s, and that's when this relationship between the Pentagon and Hollywood producers became more formal, became more widespread. It was the U.S. military was working with Hollywood producers for the previous 30-odd years, from the early 20th century until the mid-40s. On various productions, and there are some big name titles like Wings, for example, from 1927. There was one where the National Guard helped out on Birth of a Nation, which you might well know as an extraordinarily racist Ku Klux Klan inspiring production in 1916, and the Home Guard helped out on that. But it wasn't systematic support, and they weren't helping. They weren't necessarily changing scripts at the time. Certainly nothing like what it's in comparison to what it's doing now. So really, the history of it begins in the mid-1940s when there's cooperation between the War Office and Hollywood, and then extending into the Cold War. Massive support for big budget productions where they lend equipment like aircraft carriers and helicopters and planes and all sorts of things to producers. And that relationship has escalated and become, in the past 25 years, has become so widespread, really, that the tentacles of the Department of Defense really spread into all aspects of of filmmaking, often very heavy script changes being made for political reasons, also involvement in extensive involvement in television shows. And then, of course, if you add in other organizations like, which you might well characterize as national security organizations and controversial organizations at that, like the FBI and the CIA, various police forces like the NYPD, LAPD, then you're looking at a very wide-ranging relationship of national security organizations with Hollywood producers, which creates very, very different scripts to what would otherwise have been produced. We think ultimately that if you include those organizations and you lay it out over the past 120 years or so, we're looking at 10,000 plus titles having been affected at script level. So it's a pretty major operation, with the Department of Defense being by far and away the largest contributor to that.
So, okay, so just to learn a little bit more about you, what made this, something that you wanted to research and pursue further?
Oh, well, thank you very much. I got into politics, international relations. I became very concerned about international relations at a relatively young age. And a lot of those concerns are actually coming to fruition over the past year or so with the way that great power rivalry has re-emerged as a major problem in the world. But I've always been concerned about that, and also about the media's role in the way that Western foreign policy in particular is represented. I got into Noam Chomsky's work, who's the most sort of famous anarchist in the world, and an expert on news media and the sort of the tendency of intellectuals, of academics, of news media systems to support political power systems at state level. And I got into his work in my early 20s, before that actually, and then did a PhD where I applied Noam Chomsky's ideas, which he generally applied to the news media in a famous book called Manufacturing Consent, but which he also really was applying to intellectual culture as a whole. And I applied that to Hollywood. And one of the reasons for that is that Chomsky, who is still alive and still working quite hard at 90, I think he's coming up to his 95th birthday, that, Chomsky just was never very interested in lowbrow culture. He was never very interested in action movies. From what I can see, he's made almost zero commentary on any sort of pop culture product. I think it sounds like the last time he went to the cinema was in the 1950s with his wife. So he's so sort of, him and some of the people around him were so out of that sort of loop, even though they kind of know what's going on, but they weren't interested in that. And so people like me took over that role. And of course, my colleague for National Security Cinema and one of the other co-producers on Theatres of War, Tom Secker, who's particularly kind of savvy to these kind of things.
Well, what just overall, especially in the modern sense, what are the various types of assistance that the DoD provides to the studios?
Well, mostly it's lending equipment and offering advice and rewrites. And they say that they offer this advice and rewrites to make these films more realistic. But of course, oftentimes they're working on things like Transformers 4, which is so ridiculous that they don't actually add to any realism at all. So really, they're very politicized changes. But in exchange, that's what they're offering is things like tanks and helicopters and stuff like that. So they give a sort of sense. It's relatively easy to spot a film that has been supported by the Department of Defense, or at least, I guess I'd probably get it right 9 times out of 10. It's something that is very unlikely to be in any way spiky towards the military. It will be very conformist in terms of the narrative it's presenting on foreign policy. It won't present anything controversial, so anything to do with, say, racism in the ranks, or even something like that, or assault and all those kind of things. But it may raise those issues so that it can then say, oh, as an institution, we are sorting those things out. So sometimes it does have kind of like one-off bad guys in the mix, so that the military can then come in and say, "Ha! Now we've fixed that problem because we're so good." So those are the kind of productions that they support, and the kind of things that they do to help. Their bargaining chip are these huge chunks of equipment, but also extras as well, because they can provide, several hundred personnel at any one time, and that can make a film just look a lot better and a lot slicker. Sometimes there are films that, and I don't know which ones but there's things like King Kong and Godzilla, and there's been various iterations of that. And when they don't actually have the Department of Defense involved, sometimes, although the scripts could well be a lot better, sometimes the actual look of the film isn't quite as good. The actual explosions that they show, the actual airplanes that they show, it's very difficult. Like aircraft carriers, if you see an aircraft carrier in a movie, it looks great. It really does look the money shot. You have the USS Vincennes, whatever it is, underneath in little typeface, and it looks a bit like reminds me of the parody of the Team America World Police parody when they have those things up. But it still gives the impression of a cinematic, sort of wonderful cinematic image. And so that's a very effective thing that the Department of Defense does, and it makes very poor films look very good. So Hollywood producers are going to love that, and of course, it saves them a couple of million bucks as well each time. So,
well, that relates to something in the documentary Theaters of War, and also in your book. There's sort of like a devil's bargain, that a Faustian bargain, I think, that the filmmakers have to enter with the DoD. In fact, there's a contractual arrangement, and so what are the conditions that the studios and the filmmakers have to accept in order to receive the DoD's help?
Here's a really important concession and agreement that they have to make. They sign a contract, which is quite a long contract. And one of those things is do not oppose the interests of the US government. So, everything comes out of that. That's one of whatever it is, 0.4F or whatever. Don't go against the interests of the American government. So those contracts tie them into making sure that they don't say anything that damages the reputation of the US military, but also of the state itself. And so it just leads to very safe narratives. And producers all love it. I mean, I don't know whether it is a Faustian bargain from their point of view. They think that they really like the military. They generally think that working with the military is a good thing, that the military does a good thing around the world. And I think they're fairly blind to that. I don't think there are many film producers who are saying, right, let's do the worst, make a horrible deal here. I guess it does sometimes happen. So, for instance, Oliver Stone, dissident filmmaker, has occasionally asked for helicopters. I think it was for Platoon and for one or two of his other Vietnam War films, and has actually been knocked back for them. So, sometimes filmmakers might cynically say, well, there's no other way for us to do this really than to ask the government, and I guess we'll just have to do it. I think ultimately for Apocalypse Now, I think they ended up getting, they asked, but it was too crazy a film for the government government or military to be keen on that. So I think they ended up getting helicopters from the Philippines, I think. So yeah, I mean that's basically the way it works, and the audience are the losers really, because we don't get to see a wider range of creative voices and creative ideas, interpretations of history. But for the producers and for the military, it works out great because it makes their life a hell of a lot easier. You make a very poor script look really good just with some decent planes and jets and it's war porn. It can be in some cases it's just war pornography, and that can sustain a film for a while, sustain people's interest in a film.
Yeah. Well, also they're gonna like anything that saves them money.
Yeah. It's usually they will save themselves $1 million at least for if it's a full cooperation.
So just I guess in layman's terms, what is the process like, when you're doing research, in acquiring these, documents, script notes, and things like that?
Well, for the first sort of half of my academic career, I was really just looking at. I wasn't looking at documentation at all. I was just looking at the way that these films were put together, looking at them as texts, if you like, and then seeing how they related to official foreign policy, whether that's in Iraq, for example, in the early 1990s, or in Somalia, in films like Black Hawk Down, for example. How they represented America at its unipolar moment, for example, in the late 1990s, when it seemed to be completely unassailable. And that was in films like Independence Day, which sort of showed America as this great behemoth which could lead the world. So that's how I was originally doing it, was for about the first, whatever it was, say 8 years. I was just looking at these things as text, and made a film with Pluto Press called Real Power, Hollywood Cinema and American Supremacy. And it was really about sort of the confluence of of embedded ideologies and the way that foreign policy was talked about. Pointing out really that the United States was always being shown as a benevolent power, even if it did make honourable mistakes in foreign policy. It was nevertheless always being a benevolent power in these movies. But I kind of finished with that, and I thought, well, I'll not do this anymore. I'll just focus on some other creative projects in my life. I didn't really want to do it. However, then I worked together with Tom Secker from around about 2014, 2015, and Tom is a relentless Freedom of Information Act guy. I think he's described in our documentary as a bulldog or a terrier or something. He put in over 100 FOIA requests. And early on, I was very encouraging of him about that, and particularly encouraging of him about it for these relationship between Hollywood producers and the Pentagon. And I put in some of the very early ones myself. For example, on the movie about Iran called Argo from 2012. And about 8 years later, literally during lockdown, 8 years later, I got a series of about 60 odd pages of emails between the CIA and Ben Affleck about Argo. So that's how. So the sort of second half of the second part of my kind of academic work came when we started looking in great deal of detail at these documents, basically just saying, what are the agreements that the Pentagon and these other organizations have with these producers? Where are their script changes? Can we get hold of the script changes? I mean, that's not always been easy because they're quite cagey about that. But also, one of the main things we got is this huge database, just a massive list of all the films and TV shows that had ever been cooperated on. And that database called DARPA is something that just wasn't available until me and Tom contacted the sort of head of the PR, the PR guy at the Pentagon, and he let slip to us that there was this existence of this database. And of course, that meant that we could put in an FOIA request. And that kind of opened up this this huge this huge amount of cascading amount of files that came out of that. And then we've just been picking through that information ever since.
What, to your knowledge, or in your opinion, would you say are maybe some of the films or series of films that have received the most military involvement and assistance?
Well, the most involvement has probably been on things like the whole Transformers series. I was just looking if I could find a convenient list in my bookshelves behind me, but I'll do it off the top of my head. This is a French translation of my first book, which came out a couple of years ago. I'm not going to be able to flick through that one because I'm not going to understand it. Some of the biggest ones have been the Transformers series, some of the films by Peter Berg, like The Kingdom, but also the Marvel franchise in particular. Has been very heavily controlled by the state. In fact, Tom Secker and one of our colleagues, Tricia Jenkins, wrote a book called Movies, Superheroes and the State, which came out about 18 months ago. And that was just purely about the whole Marvel universe, and then to some extent the DC universe, and pointing out these very extensive changes that they've found through the FOIA documentation. In addition to, but there was, so for instance, they through about 8 or 9 pages in that book, they run through how Iron Man began in its original script as a really anti-war statement, with the Robert Downey Jr. character being very opposed to his father's arms company, and all those kind of narrative and character arc developments which were consistent with an anti-war product. But by the time the DoD had gone through it, it ended up turning into this thing where the Robert Downey Jr. character is basically reflecting the utility of the arms trade to benefit mankind. I think he says, and I think there's a nice line where he says something like, "Peace means having a bigger stick than the other guy. Peace means having a bigger stick than the other guy." So, completely the opposite to an anti-war statement. So those are the sort of biggest ones that off the top of my head. But some of the ones that are kind of interesting are where there are, close, where the amount of involvement is slightly less clear, and the changes are sometimes more subtle. So on things like Avatar, maybe on Hotel Rwanda, things like Terminator. The Terminator series really went downhill as the Department of Defense got further and further involved. And we don't always have the exact script changes for those, but we know, I don't know, sort of 80 or 90% of them, I guess. And I suppose also it's a bit difficult. You asked the question, what are the ones where they're most involved? I don't know if it's a misnomer or not, but as soon as they get any script, as soon as they contract in any script, they've got full control over that. I mean, there might be some to and fro between the producers and the Department of Defense, but the Department of Defense has contracted them in. So it's almost like they've kind of got equal control over everything. And also bear in mind, with a series like Transformers, there's going to be less that they're going to have to control, because it's already a massive advert for the big car companies. Right. It's already a massive advert for the military industrial complex. And it's already completely irrelevant, or even kind of, again, sort of going back to the war porn fetishization of the military, it's already doing all that. So there's less work that they have to do on those things. Sometimes the most important changes are ones where they might change 2 things in the whole script, but that's the key, because it shifts everything. So take, for instance, the Meet the Parents. That character, the Robert De Niro character in the year 2000, he was originally going to be presented as being a torturer from the 1980s, killing a bunch of people throughout Central America. And he was presented as having these torture manuals in his office. And it was linked to the real world, the Contras and all this kind of stuff. He would have been the most sinister. I don't think they could have done so Meet the Fockers after that. It would have been too much. And one of the reasons for that, and the producers loved it, because the producers were really happy because they wanted to make it a bit gentler. The CIA suggested, why don't you just have, instead of having all these photographs around of all these torture manuals around that link to El Salvador and so on, why don't you just have the De Niro character meeting Bill Clinton and Yasser Arafat and stuff like that? And they were like, oh, yeah, that's so much better. So it's sometimes the small changes that can have a particularly significant impact on the script, or indeed on a whole franchise, character arc. Or take Avatar, for instance, where we don't know the exact changes, but Avatar was close to being a really strong, and also one of the biggest franchises of all time. It's kind of close to being quite a in-your-face anti-war and pro-environmental statement. But you notice some subtle things about the script that have shifted. One of them being that that the military, the sort of the American style military in that, are very pointedly in the script framed as being mercenaries, and very pointedly in the script they make it that the real US military are still at home on Earth fighting the good fight. They make this clunky dialogue in the middle of this film so that they take the curse off any of this. And there's other tiny changes like that you might not barely even notice. But anyway, I feel like I'm slightly rabbiting on there, but it's a slightly long answer to a relatively short question. But those are the kind of things that are happening. That they are sucking up everything, and they will do whatever they need to do a good PR job in terms of altering these films. But it's a very varied picture in terms of what they have to do on all of these.
Well, you mentioned, so on this question of control, you had mentioned earlier what happens when some of these productions are denied and they walk away and have to get military hardware from another country. Another example that I think comes up in the documentary is the film 13 Days about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which had a similar situation. But there's also in the documentary, as I recall, a list of films that were denied cooperation and then were never made. At least I think that's the implication. I think what is being implied is that a denial can put the kibosh on a production. However, I mean, we know there are many, many reasons why films don't get made. But can, in your opinion, the DoD effectively cancel a production by not cooperating with it?
Well, yeah. I mean, we found several examples, which I mentioned in the film, of a very specific list. That was kind of like the named list of things where we know that the production had got somewhere down the line, and then the DoD was the main contributor to it not continuing. And I think Roger lists whatever it is, a couple of dozen or so named examples there. And I'll give you one example. Was a film called Countermeasures in 1994, which was going to be starring Sigourney Weaver. Right. And they'd also at one point had Gina Davis signed up for it as well. It was going to be set on an aircraft carrier. The script is done. It's greenlit by the studio. But of course, the one hurdle that they still have to get over is this script going to be, are they going to be allowed to set it on an aircraft carrier? American government says no. Specifically the PR people at the Pentagon, and they say we have no reason. And of course, the script is about corruption and arms sales, illegal arms sales, and they which links back to Iran-Contra, which is the big scandal from the 1980s, which I'm sure many of your listeners will know. And what the Pentagon PR people said was, we have no reason to denigrate the White House or remind the public of the Iran-Contra scandal. So there's a really clear example, and Roger lists further very clear examples in the documentary. But actually, there's more than that, really. That's kind of dwarfed, really, by what we also know, which is that there are several 100,000 pages of material. And I think it's at the U.S. Navy. Which we've not been able to acquire yet. And they are rejected scripts, which are apparently from floor to ceiling, stacked up high in boxes. I don't know the exact dimensions of this, but it sounds like an enormous, it would cost probably several tens of thousands of dollars just to get them to send that material over. And in a way, I don't blame them for that. I'm not saying that they're being particularly awkward about that. I think simply the job of them providing us with that enormous quantity of rejected material, and this is just from the Navy, I think would be a giant bureaucratic job. So we don't know in those particular circumstances, in those particular examples, the extent to which the rejection was vital, but it's obviously of some relevance to the reason that the production didn't occur. But the Countermeasures example is a really good one. Shall I give you one other? Fields of Fire from 1993. And one of the reasons this one's so illustrative is because it was a book that was written by the Undersecretary of the Navy. So written by one of the most powerful people in the United States in the military. It was used by the Marines, the book, because they really liked it. It was it was like the textbook for what happened in Vietnam. The Marines themselves wanted the book to be adapted into a movie, and the rest of the Pentagon was completely fine with that. Who wasn't fine with it? The PR department of the Pentagon. They were the ones who prevented that from being made. It was used as an official training manual within the armed services, but they didn't like it because it showed fragging of officers. In other words, what sometimes happened was the murder of senior officers, and it showed U.S. forces burning huts in Vietnam, burning down villages in Vietnam. They just didn't want a single bit of that to spread. So I would like to emphasize that while I certainly don't hold any brief for the military by any means, or personnel, I don't see what we're doing as being opposed to military personnel. We are. I am definitely opposed to the Pentagon, but I'm even more opposed to the PR people at the Pentagon. I mean, mixing the most sort of violent approach to the world with PR probably is the worst thing I can think of. Maybe that's the reason why I've carried on with this work. It seems like it does seem like the right thing to do, to oppose people who are doing that, who are literally trying to twist history about the most horrible things that our civilization has done in history. And let me also just add very quickly, my country is part of this as well. Don't think I'm having a go at the United States. This is a civilizational problem. Yeah. This is a Western civilizational problem. And of course, the East may do something comparably horrific in the coming years, but we're not there yet.
This relationship between DOD and Hollywood, though, it's not a secret, as you point out in the documentary. We could say it's hiding in plain sight.
Yeah.
But what is DOD doing to hide or mask its relationship with Hollywood, or simply just not publicize it?
Well, it publicizes it, but it publicizes it on its own terms. It says, we're here to help Hollywood producers, and it produces slick adverts to do that, and it has done for a very long time. It's basically just trying to hide a lot of the process of that. And I think rather than trying to go through everything on that, I'll just give an example. One of the reasons that we didn't know anything about this until our team got involved, or next to nothing, was because there was one academic called Lawrence Seward who had all of the relevant documentation from the 1970s until just a few years ago. He died in 2019, I think, and then the library opened up of his archive. He was the only person who had that documentation which was relevant to the entire 20th century and into the 21st century. Lawrence Seward, we have again subsequently found out, had been contracted in at least a couple of times for paid work with the Department of Defense. But beyond that, he was also just a very peculiar person to work with as an archivist and as a historian. From what we can see, he never shared any of his archive that he acquired from the Department of Defense in that 4-decade plus period. We tried several times as individuals. We tried under pseudonyms to ask for a very wide range of material from Lawrence Seward. And he had obviously cooperated very closely with the Department of Defense in an unpaid capacity as well through that whole time. And quite how they would characterize that relationship, I don't know. But he certainly had all the trappings of a court historian and someone who was at the same time someone completely uninterested in sharing any of that documentation. So I'd say that's part of a very significant aspect in why this story has been heavily muted from the 1970s all the way deep into the 21st century. A hole was punctured in that wall in 2004 by this sort of renegade freelance journalist in LA called David Robb, who's excellent. But David Robb never really sustained that. He did a book about it. I did it and kind of didn't reference and organize that material fully. He just did a fairly popular book out of it. And then it was another 10 years really before anyone was able to acquire new information about that in the form of this Rosetta Stone of documentation that we received, particularly the database. So that's one. I mean, there are other reasons as well, but that's one really significant thing. It was academia. I mean, this is I think speaks extremely badly of academia as an entire institution.
I just can't imagine the situation with Lawrence Seward is so it's mind-boggling, really, and you go into it in the documentary as well. Exactly how did the documentation end up in that person's hands? So much of it, is it unclear?
It's fairly unclear, and I won't attribute any particular name to this. But when I went to the library in Washington DC, and I asked these same questions, and it was quite an awkward conversation. And I think it was an awkward conversation in part because I think they weren't comfortable with the entire process or scrutiny of the entire process. That at one point they said to me that he and it wasn't clear whether they were talking metaphorically or literally, but at one point they did say that he literally picked up the material as though from a skip, like the Pentagon had just got all of their papers, put it in a great big I don't know what you call them in United States. Not a skip, is it? You know what I mean? Like a huge outdoor refuse.
Like a bin?
Like a bin,
a
yeah.
Trash bin?
A trash bin, yeah. Like a trash compactor. I thought they said a skip. Maybe it was a trash compactor or whatever it was. And then he just said, "Oh, can I have them?" And
sure.
It all sounded very unlikely. And so the possibility of this being to one extent or another, the possibility of this actually being the Department of Defense co-opting, asking Lawrence Seward to act as a repository of their documentation in a private archive so that they were not liable to respond to Freedom of Information Act requests seems quite high to me. At least at some level, there was a desire. To the extent that there was a full-on plan about that, I'm not sure, but there was evidently a desire. In fact, they've said it in emails to us. They say, "Oh, we don't have that. You need to go and speak to Lawrence Seward." And then, of course, Lawrence Seward says no. So they're able to farm out material into private hands, which is sensitive, and that means that they are protected because Freedom of Information Act. They have to respond to that by law, but they don't have to respond if some private guys just picked it up from a bin.
So obviously, in pertaining to Godzilla, the nuclear bomb is like a big deal. And just on the subject of the nuclear bomb, how does the DoD insist on it being portrayed in film? What are maybe some of their rules or hang-ups when it comes to how the nuke is portrayed?
Yeah, nuclear weapons are a very sensitive issue, alongside things like any accusations of assault, racism, military incompetence, all those kind of issues, chemical and biological weapons as well. So war crimes. And of course, nuclear weapons are in a way the epitome of all of the horror of everything. So they are very careful about the way that they handle them. I'll make a couple of comments about that. There's a film called Broken Arrow, for example, from the 90s, which you might well remember. Christian Slater, I think.
Yep, John
I've only-
Travolta. Yeah.
Yeah, I think maybe I've only seen it once, so my memory of it's fairly dim. You know, that depicts the loss of nuclear weapons being stolen. And that is something that the Department of Defense, that's going to be a hard no. That's going to be what they call a showstopper. Not interested in supporting a film that shows that nuclear weapons are not safe. So, and that happens in several movies that don't get cooperation. Anything that shows nuclear weapons are not secure, not in control. Let me make a point about that. If you go through, if any of your listeners go through the literature on safety and nuclear weapons, you will see a terrifying list of near misses. In every possible way, whether that's allowing pizza delivery people into bunkers when the guards are asleep, or objects falling down on other objects right near nuclear weapons and nearly detonating things, the loss of whole weapons, and all sorts of mismanagement of nuclear weapons, which of course happens, but you wouldn't know that for the movies. So they're very careful about that. And let me I would say two other examples fairly briefly. One is just to say, one of the reasons that the Terminator franchise went so bad is because it was really obvious that the Department of Defense wanted to stop nuclear weapons from looking as dangerous in that series. Now, this might well have been done with the contrivance of the producers, and the absence of James Cameron as the main filmmaking force. But you know, that fourth film is so stupid, it is unbelievable. They have several nuclear weapons go off in that film with no one suffering any effects.
Yeah.
Like no one's got radiation poisoning, no one's hair's falling out. That film literally ends with someone having open heart surgery outdoors after a nuclear detonation, and then they fly off into the sunset saying that the US military will always protect us. It's offensive. I'm offended. So there's an example. One other thing I'd say though, that the film Oppenheimer, which is coming out, I think in maybe couple of weeks or something like that.
It's July.
Looks amazing. There's no indication that the Department of Defense has been involved in that.
Good. I was wondering about that.
I'm very hopeful. I've not seen anything that indicates that. I've not seen any reviews of it yet, but it looks like it's going to be terrifying. And goddamn, I hope that it is. I hope that it wakes people up to this, because there's been a whole generation and more who have not understood nuclear weapons at all. Yeah. And we really need to, as a species and as a civilization.
We always talk about the 2014 Godzilla. I think in either the documentary or maybe it was one of the articles on Tom Secker's website or something. I just remember, you know, there's the plot line where the enemy monster steals a nuke, and I think in the script it was a U.S. nuke, and then they changed it to a Russian nuke. And then of course at the end of that movie you have a nuclear bomb going off in the middle of the ocean, and then it's just everyone's happy at the end. Nothing said of any fallout or anything like
only
that.
About 15 minutes by boat off the shore of San Francisco.
That actually reminds me as well of I forgot about this example, but it's kind of a perfect example. If you remember the film True Lies, with Jamie Lee Curtis and Arnold Schwarzenegger, a nuclear bomb goes off behind them in the sea just as they kiss. They're like husband and wife reuniting as the nuke goes off, but in a positive way. It's like, it's fine. It's just it's been kind of disposed of. Like, it's all right. That was a Department of Defense supported movie, and I'd say actually, on a rare caveat, I would say perhaps there's 2 or 3 movies that have ever been any good that have had Department of Defense involvement. True Lies is one of them. Well done, Arnie.
There's also
it's still a racist piece of crap, though. I should add, but it's kind of funny.
the second of the most recent American Godzilla movies also portrays radiation in general as a life force, and there is a scene in which a nuclear weapon is purposely detonated to revive Godzilla, and so it is, a nuclear weapon saves the day. Going back to this attitude around not just nuclear weapons, but military hardware and military force in general. I think one of the interesting contrasts between the way, again, going back to Godzilla, if you'll indulge us, very rarely, if ever, does Godzilla get vanquished in a Japanese film by military force alone. Usually, because the monsters are essentially more or less forces of nature, the monsters, like a tsunami, will recede and an earthquake will pass. The monsters fight it out and work things out eventually they resolve the situation amongst themselves, for lack of a better way of putting it. But right from the get-go, as soon as American studios and filmmakers started trying to adapt Godzilla for an American audience, one of the first productions of that type was in the 1980s. It wasn't successfully made, but the script was fairly far along in development, and that one turned to the military, or there was a quasi-military action that eventually put a stop to the monster. And then 10 or so years later, when we had the film made by Roland Emmerich and Dean Devlin, Godzilla was killed by fighter jets on the Brooklyn Bridge. So it's a very different way of looking at the world and the way these types of problems are resolved. And as I think you've said, I mean, it's this attitude that's really, whether or not the Department of Defense is involved, or whether, or regardless of what level they're involved, these attitudes are ingrained in Hollywood already, and they surface.
Yeah, I quite agree, and I'm keen to listen to you about Godzilla, because it's not an area that I feel I can specialize in. I'm here for the context, really. I've seen most of those Godzilla films, I think, and I remember the cartoon Godzilla from the 80s when I was a kid. I don't think there was any military involvement in that in a cartoon. That would be unlikely. But yeah, I mean, these are examples of. I mean, there's a distinction, isn't there, between something. So if a culture is very militarized and fetishizes the military, then that's one thing. But one of the questions we've tried to answer over the past 10 years or so is that culture militarized because of top-down things, or from bottom-up things? And the answer really is, actually, it's very top-down controlled. I mean, of course, there's going to be people who like watching violence and like military regalia and like watching things going bang and all that. Of course, that's not entirely objectionable, really. But I think what we emphasize is that there is a lot of top-down control by the state for these things. And I suppose you could also, I don't want to get myself into trouble with the American gun lobby, but also if you are talking about those kind of things, the fact that there is a large gun lobby, and that people are selling, that corporations are also selling a lot of guns as well, probably feeds into that as well. I've only read some of the literature on that, but it's interesting. Even going back to the 19th century, the kind of the promotion of gun culture and the promotion of the Wild West and all that kind of image was, something of a construction. Anyway, that's perhaps by the by. But I think the point is that if that top-down process was not occurring, I think that our civilization, and in this particular instance, in particular, the United States, would be a much more normal political culture. And I think at the moment it's really abnormal. It's weird, and that's not healthy for anyone on the planet. And the real kicker for that, the major factor for that is the top down self-interested control of these sort of very unpleasant organizations which are dominating popular culture.
Well, yeah, it's like it's kind of permeated, like Steve mentioned, the sequel, Godzilla King of the Monsters, that did not have DoD involvement, but the nuke is still portrayed as like the thing that saves the day. And it's almost alarming that, like, the 2014 movie, you look at it and you can say, okay, they had to accommodate this note and that note and whatever. it's almost alarming that another movie was made without their involvement, where that's just what the writers went to without being told to.
Yes, the one that they wanted to do,
Right.
which was a much more natural reflection of what the of what sort of society, what the political culture, popular culture wanted. But yeah, when the DoD gets involved, it's very much kind of like they're not necessarily pushing against the grain, but they're certainly controlling the direction and speed and type of that grain, really moving with it. And it's they're a very, very big player. The head of the PR people, Phil Strubb, said a few years ago, retired a couple of years ago, but he said that he basically was not powerful at all. He said he was like the equivalent of a eunuch in an imperial court. This is from a guy who's been really, really heavily involved in something like 12 of the top 20 franchises of all time. Someone who personally, if anyone had ever written out his IMDb page properly, would have included many hundreds of productions. Probably the most powerful person in Hollywood. Maybe people dispute that, but there's no one who's had as much of an impact as the Department of Defense in Hollywood, and also, of course, a largely secretive impact as well, and that's part of the key problem with it.
So, from what I understand, in the more immediate post-war era, they were mainly helping on things like war films, stuff like that. I know I was reading on Tom Secker's site that the 1954 movie Them, about the giant ants, they didn't want to, they refused to be involved because they said this is a crazy scenario that never happened. And then, about 20 years later, they're assisting on things like, the 1976 remake of King Kong. At what point did they shift and start to say, hey, maybe these science fiction movies, these fantasy films are things that we should step in and have a word with? Why the change in that's so unrealistic we won't be involved, to now where, they're working on Transformers and all that stuff?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I'm not sure if I know the exact answer to that. I think certainly in the 1950s and 60s, there was a reluctance to get involved in science fiction and anything that seemed kooky, as a sort of fear of kind of contaminating the whole reputation of everyone involved with the Department of Defense. So take in particular UFO movies. They're there was a blanket policy not to work on UFO movies, and that was a stated blanket policy: no involvement with UFO movies. And that persisted until the 1970s. So I imagine that this change that you're talking about is consistent with the example you've given there. Yeah. So around about the 70s, I think there was perhaps a shift, but that has then exploded basically since the end of the Cold War. There's been a massive opening up of not just the genre of movies that they'll be involved in, but also in the kind of channels on which they're being disseminated. Because a lot of this is all done online now as well. For instance, there's a new recruit for the US military, a woman who's, I forget her name off the top of my head, but she's kind of very sexy and kind of exciting person who's showing off her skills within the US security services and militarized services. And she's kind of one of these, it was like an Instagram influencer, basically. Mm-hmm. And there's a big question mark as to whether she's kind of like a just someone who's blogging like that, or whether she's actually be on the payroll of the military. And she keeps playing with that image, but it seems extremely likely because various bits of evidence suggest that she'll be on that payroll. But there's all sorts of ways in which the military has opened up and become much more imaginative in terms of the direction of its public communications. And I would say there's definitely a shift in the 70s, and they tried to get more creative at that point. I mean, look at the way that the CIA operated in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. The CIA was not even mentioned in a film until Hitchcock's North by Northwest in 1959. It the CIA was basically just there to go, we just don't dare say anything about us.
Right.
We don't want anything out there. So it was much more buttoned down. So it's 40s, 50s, 60s in terms of the attitudes of these powerful organizations. It was only when it was mentioned in the Hitchcock film, you couldn't even see the word CIA. Hitchcock cuts it deliberately so that you could just see intelligence agency. It's a nice little twist that he does. And then the CIA isn't mentioned again then for another 3 years until the film Dr. No, James Bond film, where it's mentioned for about 10 seconds. And it's not even until really well into the 1960s that the CIA starts to become something that anyone even admits really exists in popular culture. So, that's a kind of nearly 20-year period, really, where they're just sort of washing their hands of anything to do with politics and, trying to keep everything very quiet. So it was really after that kind of point, getting into the 1970s, particularly because they realized that the world was changing so much. There was a great deal. There was peace movements. There was democratic movements. The United States foreign policy couldn't just do whatever it wanted after Vietnam. And so for these kind of reasons, the propaganda apparatus started to become more sophisticated and more diverse and more creative. So that was quite a long answer to your question. And I don't exactly know when that period came where they said, let's change science fiction, but that's the kind of thing that was going on.
Well, on the topic of Godzilla also, I believe in the Theaters of War documentary, it's mentioned that they were not involved in the 98 version. And, like Steve said, that's still one where Godzilla is killed by the fighter jets and everything. Why do you think that maybe they didn't assist on that one? I know that that's one where it's very, Godzilla's fast. And so, the helicopters and stuff that are chasing him through the city, they're the ones blowing up all the buildings and not Godzilla. Do you think that might have anything to do with that?
Yeah, and in fact, I think we may have documentation on that, which I don't remember terribly well. It may actually even be one of those ones that Lawrence Seward, the extremely conservative court historian, I think has reported on, because I'm sure that there's a reference to this in his 2002 book. And I think it was to do with the apparent recklessness of the US military. So anything like that, it's just they're not going to like. I mean, I was just watching a couple of weeks ago the movie Die Hard, for example. They're not going to support that because there's a scene in which they sort of flying into the battle zone saying, hey, this is just like Vietnam, and they're about to get all trigger happy. The DOD is going to say no to that. Anything that makes them look out of control, anything that makes it look like they can't protect and aren't willing to protect the American people, they will chuck it. They will chuck it. So I think that's probably the case with the 1998 one. I wish I could remember off the top of my head, but I think that's it.
Yeah. So I was going to ask, getting back to the 2014 movie, I have a question about servicemen. The main character, Ford, played by Aaron Taylor Johnson. In the script, there's a little more to him in that, his life at home, his relationship with his wife, his family is a little more strained. A lot of their notes didn't seem to like that. They also said he was irresponsible and neglecting his duties, being too easily distracted from his duties as a serviceman. What kind of portrayal of servicemen do they need to meet their standard? I know Tom Secker said that they basically stripped that character of having any kind of important character arc or anything because they basically turned him into kind of a walking, bland kind of G.I. Joe doll.
Yeah, the US military often does this, kind of turning main characters into G.I. Joe dolls, so that they're kind of very bland and sort of first-person player. I mean, look at the character in Avatar, for example, or but yeah, a lot of what they're trying to do is to that is obviously important, and that will be the case for that particular character. Often what they're trying to do is just clear themselves of any association with anything nightmarish. And one way that they can often do that is to demilitarize the whole script. So, for instance, in the film Hulk from 2003, they, there's all sorts of chemical and biological weapons flying around in that, but the military supported that movie. And they changed one of the many things they changed on that script was they changed the operation to capture the Hulk from Operation Angry Hand to what was it? They changed the operation because the operation that they'd called it accidentally gave it the name of a chemical weapons program that the United States had used in Vietnam, a defoliation program that they'd used in Vietnam. So they altered that. But as part of that whole context, it's worth bearing in mind that the cover letter that the Department of Defense sent to the producers of Hulk said they didn't actually say the word sorry because they're a bit careful about that, but they basically, in a very apologetic tone, said, we are sorry that we've had to change so much on this script. And that's because there was so many things that were kind of potentially thorny about that script. If you've got a massive this kind of monster, this Incredible Hulk monster sort of smashing through a bunch of stuff with chemical and biological weapons everywhere, it's going to create issues for the Department of Defense PR team. That's the kind of thing that they want to get rid of. And so that will be completely consistent with the leading character that you're referring to there. It's just kind of a sort of constant sieve that it's a filtration system that they have to prevent anything controversial coming out. And it's kind of, once you can see that, it's kind of predictable and obvious, the kind of thing that they'll get rid of. It's also very instructive because it shows you the kind of thing that, if we know what our governments are up to, we know the kind of things that they want to repress, kind of common sense things, really. But it's anything that makes them look like the bad guys.
As far as the actual atomic bombings, of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there's a scene in the 2014 Godzilla where Serizawa, the Japanese scientist, is describing, the atomic bomb, and I think his father's experience and living through it. And he has this kind of almost harrowing kind of speech about it. And, and that was considered what you'd mentioned earlier, a showstopper, which means like, that's like something where, they'll hard no, absolute, like no negotiation needs to be removed. But why do you think why do you think the topic of the bombings is still such a taboo all these years later? It's something that everyone knows we did. It's something that, everyone knows the massive loss of life that occurred. Why have such a problem with just basically someone mentioning like, hey, my dad lived through that and it was horrible?
Well, I guess I think that speaks to the sensitivity. Like I said, this isn't just the military. The military is nightmarish enough in its organization, particularly the Pentagon. But I imagine that there are probably quite a few people in the Pentagon who wouldn't particularly care about, that particular little speech, which isn't terribly consequential anyway. But remember, we're also dealing with a PR organization, which is going to be even more stringent, hardline, authoritarian, and censorious about what it's going to see out there. It doesn't want to have any indication of anything that can. It's not going to have its mindset is not like that. The office's mindset is not geared towards allowing that kind of creativity. It doesn't want to be setting those kind of precedents. And I remember, the nuclear bomb, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is important for lots of reasons. One of them being that, at least from what I can see, Japan had already surrendered, and so this is a massive historical controversy, which they want to keep a lid on. You don't want even a little scene in it. They don't want some smarty pants journalist reviewing that and then starting to talk about what actually happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it's like the thin end of the wedge. It's like that thing I was saying about the CIA and Meet the Parents. if they'd had torture manuals there, what happens if some reviewer or some journalist picks up on the fact that that's in a mainstream film, and then they write a little article that comes out of that, and then someone else picks up on that, and suddenly the whole thread, the whole tangle of lies that is the United States foreign policy starts to unravel.
Right.
They don't, that's not their way. That's not their mindset. They're not interested in that. So anything that even hints at those kind of things, they will want to destroy. And also to make it ahistorical. They don't even want people to be thinking about history. They, you know, man's inhumanity to man, I think, is the way that they changed that script. Yeah, that's lovely. Yeah,
it's kind of interesting the way the government, for lack of a better, has kind of there's two sides to the way it has approached the popular representation of the atomic bomb, going back to the reporting by John Hersey in the 1940s, and him trying to publish his dispatches about Hiroshima and the problems he encountered there, and eventually the book Hiroshima was condensed, the reporting was published in book form, and it's now probably the single most important documentation of what happened there in the world. And you mentioned the sensitivity around portraying Hiroshima and Nagasaki in film, and but at the same time, from the very early stages of the atomic weapons program, there's been a concerted effort to publicize the power of the nuclear bomb as a good thing. There was a documentary produced by the government for television about the detonation of the first hydrogen bomb, and it aired on primetime television. And throughout the 50s and 60s, there was a movie studio operated by the government called Lookout Mountain that essentially disseminated atomic bomb footage and had a say in how it was presented in films, but it was actively promoting, films of actual atomic bomb tests that could be inserted into a lot of science fiction films, including some of the Godzilla type films from that period. It's a really interesting. Go ahead.
There is an interesting contradiction there, isn't there? I was watching, I think, is it Robert Lifton's documentary about Hiroshima just last night, because I was recommended it yesterday by someone. And I think that might point to part of the issue. There's a big difference between between showing off your atomic weapons and your power and the actual impacts of those. Just in the same way as there's a fairly big difference between, showing a boxing match in which, someone wins after 3 rounds and, hooray, he's won that fight, and someone winning after 15 rounds, battering that person into a coma. The actual victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki really bring home what that was all about, the use of the bomb. And I mean, I was only sort of half watching it last night because I didn't really want to be having those kind of nightmares. So I think what Lookout Mountain did, from what I can see, and I think what the United States is happy about having, is projecting power through nuclear weapons. But they don't want to show the impacts of that, because people will start to feel things. And as soon as you start people being humane and knowing some history, then that's the thin end of the wedge as far as the American and the whole Western Empire is concerned.
You made a comment earlier about a parallel to our gun culture, and I see a similar dynamic there, where guns are sort of ingrained into American culture and popular culture, and they symbolize power and independence and things like that. But we don't really like to talk about the trade-off that we have, the bargain, the Faustian bargain that we've made with ourselves, where we are killing people all the time, and we have public places that are, you're kind of gambling with your life when you go into them.
I mean, American gun culture, it seems like a terrible idea to me, but at the same time, it's a domestic issue, and it is not one that I particularly feel comfortable about. It's a domestic issue for a start, but also it's one that I don't know the literature on very well. So it's something for you guys to sort out.
Oh, thanks. Yeah.
I'll deal with the rest of the world.
Yeah, we'll get right to work on that, Matt.
Yeah.
We'll get back to you. No.
Thanks, that'd be great.
Do you know, or have you heard anything about any involvement that they may have had in the most recent Godzilla versus Kong, or there's a sequel they're working on right now? Have you heard anything about involvement there at all at this point?
In all honesty, I have not heard about that, and if I did, I know where I'd hear from it. Hear
Right.
about it. It would be from Tom Secker, because he's crazy about the kaiju, and he will be. And he's more on it than I am, and always has been more on it in terms of the Freedom of Information Act requests.
And his website is the Spy Culture.
Spyculture.com
right?
is
they did a really good article about monster movies and stuff, which is where I've pulled a lot of my questions from.
Quick question, can I interject here? I was curious, following up on your question, Kyle, is there a way to track these projects and the DoD involvement in real time, or do you always find out about it after the fact?
Well, at the moment, it is after the fact. I mean, as a team, we are quite proactive in terms of putting out Freedom of Information Act requests in good time for all of these things. But that said, we've only been doing that for whatever it is, 7 or 8 years. We're still a little bit ad hoc with it, because we're a relatively, we're a small team of we're misfits in a way, really. I mean, Roger Stahl is an established full-time professor in the United States, but me and Tom are part-time workers who are not really not proper paid researchers or anything. So we are the slightly oddballs in this. So there are things that do fall through our net. But I think that's decreasingly the case as Roger Stahl has become more of a leading figure within our group. And he's the executive producer, as you know, of the documentary Theatres of War. And so that's sort of formalized things a bit. I don't know exactly when we'll know the answer to those more recent Godzilla films and whether there's Department of Defense involvement. And still less, we like I say, we often don't know for several years afterwards actually what the impact has been. We sometimes know about take a series like Homeland, for example. It obviously seemed extremely likely that the CIA had been involved in Homeland, because it just looks like that, and also that Homeland Security had been involved in it. But actually, at the time, there was not even an isolated mention in anything, including interviews or anything like that, to indicate that it had been supported by the CIA. It was only when I received that documentation from the CIA, I think in 2014, many years into the series, that we actually could say, well, yeah, for sure, this definitely happened. And even then, we still don't have script changes for that. But that's partly a CIA thing, that they are quite cagey about their script changes, even more so than the DoD. So yeah, we don't know everything, and that's one of the reasons that we also ask people to do stuff. This isn't all about us. If you or other people want to put in FOIAs, then for goodness sake, do it. We'd love that, and please be in contact with us. The only way that this is gonna, or the best way that to make a better political culture, but also a better popular culture, is going to be through mass involvement.
We've actually discussed that amongst ourselves, and we may, if you don't mind, reach out to you for guidance, because it's not an area where we have a lot of experience. And also, I think with an FOIA, you really have to target it to the correct agency, and often that's not a clear thing.
FOIA is very annoying. They find a lot of reasons. I mean, it's even worse if you go to the NSA, the National Security Agency. They will really tie you up in bureaucratic knots and codified reasons why you can't find out things. And also, and I certainly know that both in the British and the American cases, Tom Secker has been very, very good at picking through that. And he's probably one of, if not the leading expert in Britain about the use of the FOIA. But he's busy on lots of things. So but I certainly think that if you contact one of us, we will do our very best to assist with all those kind of things, and we'll find someone who can make that work. There's so much to go through still in the documentation. I mean, we did the book, the 2017 book that Tom and I did was a kind of a fairly quick compendium of everything that we had, and it was a digestion of everything, and I think it turned out really well, and we've sold loads of copies of that. But it wasn't really until 5 years later, when Theatres of War came out, the documentary, that we'd had Roger be able to go through all of that material and really flesh out the details very nicely. And now what's happening is that we're slowly working towards a large academic book, which will really fill in all of the little blanks, and that's being led by Roger, as I think. And but that could take a while, and the more people that we have on board with that, the better.
Well, it sounds like that's probably the closest thing to a solution, is getting more people to request. And as much of a pain as it is, it's the only way that I think this stuff's going to get out there, and that's probably the only thing we can do is request more information.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if you think about the United States and Britain was going to bomb Syria in 2015, and this is obviously way bigger than this kind of PR issue that we're referring to. But it just took a few hundred, maybe a couple of thousand phone calls to people's congressmen. And Barack Obama, as president, had to say, yeah, we're not going to do that after all. It doesn't take a great deal of public pressure to have a quite considerable effect. So, even if we had just a few dozen people saying, look, we want to know what's happening here, participating in, not just in terms of the government agencies that are involved in popular culture, but also in terms of contacting cinemas, saying we'd like to see this, we don't want to see this, and those kind of things. I think public participation would be a good thing. But we're very used to, in this culture, and I guess as human beings generally, but perhaps particularly in this culture, we're used to sort of sitting back and just putting on the 3D glasses and the popcorn and whatever it is, right, and not really participating that much in our pop culture. But part of the reason that we have to is because as part of pop culture, we are being propagandized. So if you're being propagandized, you have to sort that out. If it's just a fun film, then go for your life, just chill out and get a Coke. But if it's particularly if it's political, then to me it seems really important to find ways to interact with that, react against, oppose, and offer solutions and offer replacements.
Well, I think what your book and your documentary and all the work you're doing is demonstrating is that even these popcorn films often are political.
Yeah.
I mean, by their very nature. Yeah. A quick question here. With the rise of CGI and the realism that can now be achieved through those kinds of techniques, do you think there will be a lessening of the need for DoD involvement, military involvement? After all, if you can't get an aircraft carrier or don't want to go that route, you can make one in your computer now, and it looks pretty good.
Yeah, I think that's a question for the real computer specialists. What I would say is that there have been something like 30 years of discussions about this, since just before I was actively involved as a researcher in this, where people were saying, Department of Defense is not going to be required anymore, and it's not come to fruition. If you look at there was I'm trying to remember what it was now, because I saw it I wasn't watching it sort of formally, I just saw it on TV. I think it was one of the King Kong movies, and they show an explosion at the end of a flight, and it doesn't look realistic because they didn't actually have support. It was bad CGI, and it just takes you out of the movie so badly. And I think that so my impression is that the Department of Defense is probably not going to go away. They certainly don't think they're going to go away. And they are certainly escalating the amount of involvement that they have. So I'm not quite sure how useful CGI is going to be. With Independence Day in the 90s, for example, they did they didn't ultimately have cooperation from the DoD, although the DoD changed the film considerably, including getting rid of a scene in which the Pentagon is blown up. But yeah, there have been false dawns, I think, with CGI. I think also, even if they did sort out CGI to that extent, I think the Department of Defense would still find ways to be very influential, because they do a little bit more what the CIA does. The CIA doesn't provide really very much. They just work more behind the scenes and earlier stages in the script production process. The CIA has nothing to offer really, except for the logo in its lobby at its headquarters. That's all it can offer. But they still are fairly effective. Nothing like as big as the Department of Defense in terms of controlling productions. But when they do control a production, such as on Argo, for instance, or on Zero Dark 30, or like the big influence they had over Meet the Parents, or all sorts of other examples, that they're really effective. They can certainly change the entire sort of ideological direction of a movie. So, I mean, I think that's worth bearing in mind, that the Department of Defense would probably adapt, even if CGI does become better than it currently is. I still think that the realism thing will remain important. But I think even if that does drift away over the next 5 or 10 years, I think the DoD will still be a massive influence over script.
Do they have to accommodate every script note to get that cooperation, or is it really just like the big showstopper protest that they have to do?
Definitely, I've seen correspondence where they sort of hammer out an agreement of some kind, but I'd say I'd have to do this systematically, but just off the top of my head, I see very little indication of producers getting back to the Department of Defense and sort of flatly saying no.
Right.
It's usually extensive script notes, sort of quite heavy-handed script notes, albeit very politely put down, in often quite long memos saying, "This is what we need." I think you're right that the showstoppers are the sort of big headline things, but there are examples of where where the Department of Defense doesn't get everything they want. There was an example on Iron Man where Robert Downey Jr.'s character makes a joke about, I can never quite remember what it was. In the original script, he says something like, I'd kill myself to get a job like that, or something like that. And they didn't like that because it referred to suicide, veteran suicide. And unfortunately, for the producers of Iron Man, the Department of Defense was really angry about that. But I think they hadn't sorted out in advance that particular line. So they ended up having a stand-up row on set about that particular one. And they ended up just compromising and just making it a sort of bland line, like, "I'd give my eye teeth for that," or something like that.
Well, I know a recent one where they gave notes and they were just like, "Oh, well, I guess we're not going to use your support," was Rampage. There was like, they didn't want any military personnel to be shown getting killed or whatever, and the filmmakers just said, "Well, like, that too bad. We're going to do it anyway."
Yeah,
and so that did not get DoD support.
Yeah, I mean, there certainly are cases where I think it's worth bearing in mind that there perhaps fewer examples of that.
Yeah,
because the filmmakers who know that their film is just not going to get DoD support. So take a film like Vice, for example, that one about Dick Cheney, which is one of the most radical and kind of in-your-face, screw you to the mainstream Hollywood movies that I've seen. I think it's a fantastic piece of work. And I'm surprised that they were able to do it. 2019, they weren't going to get any support for the little bits of foreign policy imagery that they were using there, so they just weren't going to, and just never going to ask. But yeah, and then so it's there is some pushback, but bear in mind the producers don't often usually care that much because they're not trying to make a political statement, because that's not really what Hollywood's about. So it's really the renegades like your Oliver Stones, who may make a fuss, but that usually they know not to go there anyway. You know, when Stone made Snowden, for example, he just asked for European money, and indeed most of his films he's asked for European money rather than from the American studios, let alone going to the DoD. And in fact, even though Oliver Stone's one of the most successful and famous and creatively talented film directors of all time, he, the production budget was so tight on Snowden that he couldn't even go home to the funeral of his own mother. So that's those are the kind of margins that you're dealing with, and that's how, if you're in bed with the military, you're probably going to be able to make a movie relatively easily, and it's going to look good. And
quick question:
if you're outside of that, it's going to be a problem.
Quick question: you mentioned something just a second ago about Iron Man and an on-set row, and how common is it that the DoD would have somebody on location or on set to monitor the script to make sure that whatever changes have been agreed upon are being implemented?
Yeah, they do that all the time. They have. I think that's part of the contract. I would be surprised if there were occasions where there weren't anyone. I mean, possibly if there was only very marginal changes to a script. But yeah, they have someone there to check up on that. The CIA does that as well, and we found interesting elements of that with films like The Recruit, for example, and also Charlie Wilson's War, where they where they kind of let slip, where some of the CIA agents sort of let slip, we were there to prevent Hollywood from getting too close to the truth. We were there to excise the link between our funding of the Mujahideen and 9/11. And, little statements like that, whether said on or off the record or, attributable or not, are indications of the kind of thing that these on-set advisors were doing, and they're quite kind of telling, really.
I mean, I think we've mentioned a lot of the major sources. You have your book, National Security Cinema, the Theaters of War documentary, but just for anyone checking this out, what are some of the best resources online or elsewhere where someone can learn more about this or see some of the documents? What would you recommend to people?
Sorry to be repetitive. National Security Cinema, our 2017 book, mine and Tom's. Tricia Jenkins did one, CIA in Hollywood, although that's a little bit older now. And then beyond that, Theaters of War, I'd say, is perhaps the best and most recent thing, 2022, and that's the documentary. Those are the ones that have most directly used this kind of documentation and are the most kind of that look at the most number of films and their context and their production histories. So I would recommend them more than anything else. Feel rather self-serving saying that. Is there one other that I can say? I'm trying to think.
For more up to date, in the moment as it comes. Is Spy Culture, Tom Secker's website?
Spy Culture is the thing to go to if you want the latest thing, because those productions those books and documentaries I've just referred to, they're static now. I mean, National Security Cinema, the book from 2017, was republished with a bunch of new chapters in 2021. But only in French. It's a beautiful hardback coffee table book that will look amazing on your grandmother's front room table. But unless you can read French, it's not worth it. So I would say that spyculture.com is the place to go. Yeah. Okay.
And this has been a fascinating conversation. So I really want to thank you for spending so much time with us. Do you have any social media or other resources that you'd like to promote or share so that people can keep track of the work that you're doing?
The best place to catch me is on Facebook / The Writer with No Hands. And that refers to a documentary I did back in 2014 about a screenwriter who went missing in mysterious circumstances. The Writer with No Hands on Facebook. That's the best place to connect with me and to follow my work. I post on that most days, whether about politics or about film or both.
Okay, wonderful.
International politics.
We'll follow you there, and we want to thank you for spending so much time and for indulging our Godzilla questions and being so thorough and providing, again, as Kyle said, some really important context around these issues. It's really fascinating stuff, and we intend to keep reading and learning about it. Again, Dr. Matthew Alford. His book, he's the co-author of National Security Cinema, The Shocking New Evidence of Government Control in Hollywood, which we hope we'll see an English version of that expanded edition sometime soon. That book, I think it's 2017, is that correct?
Yeah.
The original publication is available readily through Amazon and other sources. And the 2022 documentary Theaters of War, which in the United States is now streaming. I know it's on Canopy, and it may be on other platforms here and elsewhere. Thank you very much, Matt. Appreciate it very much.
Yeah, no, that's
good to learn from you too. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Kyle.
Yep.
Bye, everyone.
Take care.